Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m., Wednesday, the 19th of February, and you are watching episode 160 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Ancestral Appropriation and the Low Proof of Burden of Proof, is my best guest, Roger Karge. Roger is a Melbourne-based businessman, originally trained as a scientist. He went on to create a 40-year career and a research and development business that specialised in developing agricultural chemicals for the broadacre, cotton and horticultural industries. He still operates the business on a part-time basis today. Since 2018, he has used his skills as a research and development scientist to develop his hobby of Aboriginal and colonial history to a point where he and his group of genealogists and researchers have uncovered new facts about our history that was unknown to modern historians. A particular niche that his group have developed is the production of highly accurate genealogies and family trees of prominent Australians who claim to be Aboriginal. But the records show they are mistaken. They are in fact fakes. Some of these public figures are generally mistaken about their claim of Aboriginality, whereas others know they are fakes and even frauds. Rogers has appeared many times on the Bolt Report, where he has outlined the details of each of the fakes he has uncovered. He has also been reported in the Daily Mail Online and the Australian. He is co-author of the book Truth Telling at Risdon Cove and has another 3 books in the works, including Witness for the Prosecution about the notorious Etoch and versus Volt case in 2011. Roger is a regular contributor to both The Spectator and Quadrant magazines. He is also the editor of the Dark Emu Exposed website, where the details of his Aboriginal and colonial history researches have been posted since 2018. Welcome, Roger.
How you going, Bill? Thanks for having me on. It's good.
Just before we get started, maybe you can fill us in a little bit of your prehistory in regards to where you're born, your childhood sort of thing, and how you got into the area you finally went in. And science is pretty broad terms. I mean, we've got climate sciences. I don't hold much in them, so you might enlighten us in regards to your field of science.
Okay. I'm 67. I was born in Melbourne in 58. From just a working class background. My dad was a German immigrant. My mum was Australian, and I didn't know it then, but we go right back to convicts to about 1823. I've done my own family genealogy now, but none of us knew that then because no one really cared much in those days. So I just sort of worked my way up. I went to a really good high school in Melbourne, and then went to uni and just sort of fell in love with chemistry. And I got a bit of a gift for chemistry. So I worked for a big company like ICI, used to dominate the chemical business in Australia. And then I worked there about 11 years and then decided to go work out for myself. Didn't like the big company corporate structure. So I just started a little business with an engineering partner in Melbourne and just went from there, just started making. My specialty is you can give me a bottle of an agricultural chemical and I know how to pull it apart, work out what's in it, rebuild it and get it registered through the government and then sell it. So in those years in the 90s, there was a huge price. Agricultural chemicals cost a lot. There was a huge price margin. So we were the first generic people, one of the first generic people in Australia that used to get things like Roundup, all the big European chemicals and make generic versions of them cheaper. So we get raw materials from China and we slashed the prices in Australia. So a lot of farmers, the prices came down a lot because there was like 3 or 4 little companies like us bringing the prices down from the multinationals. And now most of the market's generic in Australia. So then I did that for a while. I still do that. I used to have a bigger business, but I've made it smaller. And then in about 2000 and I think it would have been 17 or so, I went to a friend's place and they had a copy. Can you see that? A dark emu,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
They had a copy.
It's
They
pretty
had
well
a copy.
known.
Had a copy of that on the table, and I read it, and I thought, "What this? I never learned this history. This is fascinating." And so I thought, well, why wasn't I told? So I took it and I read the whole book in a weekend. So I was pretty boring that weekend with my friends because I wasn't talking to them. But then I checked the references, and I said, "Hang on, that's not right. This is not right." And at the end, I realised, am I allowed to swear? Am I allowed to say bullshit? In the end, it was mostly bullshit. So I just chucked it on the table and I said, look, if you're an adult and you read it, good on you. It's like, remember Eric von Daniken's Chariots
Yeah,
of the
yeah, yeah.
Gods?
All the alien stuff and the big pictures of
Yeah,
the
like
field and all that sort of.
it's interesting, but good on it. And adults can cope with that because we can do a bit of critical thinking. But within a year or two, so he brought out this book, Young Dark Emu. And that's when the penny dropped. That's when it's ideology. They want to take the whole idea, put it into schools to brainwash children. And that really made me angry because I could see what they were trying to do. They were getting ready for the referendum. They're trying to make it look like Aboriginal people were farmers. Therefore, the British stole the land from them. They weren't hunter-gatherers. They should have signed a treaty. And they were going to indoctrinate the children. And so I just got a keyboard, sat in bed at night and became a keyboard warrior by myself and started my website. And then over time, I attracted people. I had 20 or 30 people working for me and just built up the Dark Emu website, which was basically to contradict and show the evidence that Bruce Pascoe was wrong. He was making it all up. And then one of our ladies who was in the group, she was a genealogist. And if you've ever seen a picture of Bruce Pascoe, you think he doesn't look very Aboriginal, right? So she did the family tree of him and said he's a fake, right? And none of us had thought of it. You just assume people are honest. And then that got the whole ball rolling. Then we ended up on the Bolt show, and Andrew Bolt got onto it, and it's just gone from there. And because we got a bit of notoriety, Aboriginal people used to send me heaps of stuff saying, look, this person's a fake. We know they're a fake. We know all the Aboriginal people in this area. They're a fake. And now I've got a list of about 100 fakes who are prominent people, right, in the public sphere or in the government. And we're just slowly going through them. So that's how I got into this, basically.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, the first um, influence with my involvement really goes back to West Australia. And I come from West Australia, but I haven't lived there since I was 15. But I've still got family over there. And in 2010, they bought out the recreational fishing licenses, and
Mhm.
the regulations allowed for Indigenous people to receive free licenses. Now, the licenses were available, the applications were available at your local post office. You could pay your fee there, and you could also get issued with the license. So some people sort of just as, just mischievous, I would class them as,
Mm.
thought, this is a bit of discrimination. No.
Yeah.
So I know family members who just went down there for, a gag sort of thing and filled out the
Mm.
form and ticked the boxes and got their free license. 15 years later, they're still getting their renewals free.
Yeah.
So was no burden of proof. The person you were giving the application to had no right to quiz you, or you didn't have to show any history or anything like that, whatever. Yeah, so it was very low burden of proof, and so anyone basically could, take advantage of the system. Now, obviously, that's crept in to academia, NGOs, all those and things and organisations that provide services and that for the government, um, and it seems fairly prevalent. And I'd like to just touch on. It's a pity that Andrew Bolt wasn't a bit more inquisitive in 2011 with his case, because
Mhm.
no having information that the person who was taken to court for defamation and racial discrimination wasn't actually an Aboriginal would have made a big difference, I would have
Sure.
thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a bit of a watershed, that case in 2011, the ETOC. So her name was Pat ETOC. She was an Aboriginal activist from the Tent Embassy, a communist, right? I've got her ASIO file. So she was from the Black Power movements in the 70s, right? So she took him to court, right? And she had nine other people that went with her, but they weren't applicants. They were a group who were like witnesses. So she was the only one taking the legal risk. All her fees were paid for. All her legal team were pro bono. She didn't pay anything. She took him to court. Everyone thought that he would win because it was in a sense, he didn't defame her. He just said things which were not very nice, but in a free society, he should be able to say that. And he was largely correct. But he lost the case. He was stunned. It went for 8 days in court, cost $1.5 million, right? And he was stunned. And then that set the whole that in my book, I'll show how that opened the floodgates, because all of a sudden now, anyone who was brazen enough to cover their face with a bit of clay, put on a Aboriginal t-shirt and a possum coat, and say, "I'm Aboriginal," they knew they were safe because no one had the courage to challenge them anymore. Because if Andrew Bolt couldn't challenge you, and he's got the power of Herald Weekly
Yeah.
Times behind him, no one would challenge. So then they all came out of the woodwork, and they're the people I'm catching now. And then about 4 or 5 months ago, just before Christmas, Andrew, because I've been on his show a few times, Andrew sent an email saying, "Just by the way, Roger, I should have done this years ago, but can you check Pat Eatock? Is she Aboriginal?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'll have a look." But we all thought she was.
Mm.
And we did the work, and she's not. She's a fake, right? And so this is, and so I've been on his show. I've done the thing. I'm writing a book on it, but this has opened a big can of worms for me. Right? I'm just a normal Aussie like you. I thought this country was honest, pretty much honest, and we're all pretty fair. And if you did something wrong, you'd go to jail or get a big fine. I think we're deeply corrupted because now I'm looking at this court case. Andrew Bolt says he was stitched up, and I think he was. I think there's a lot of forces at work who set that case up to put her in there, knowing they didn't care about her being offended. They wanted to bring down Andrew Bolt, right? This is my theory, right? It's only my theory. I've got no proof just yet, but the way it's set up is to chop him off at the knees because he's the only guy in Australia courageous enough to stand up and talk about these issues. Everyone's scared. So that's true. She's a fake. And this is the country we live in now. She's just one.
But it still beggars belief. I mean, if you go and claim some benefit from the government,
Mm,
normally, you have to provide details, information. They'll check a lot of things about you, but I mean, not going to claim to be indigenous, but generally for most processes, to receive a benefit, there's actual efforts to make sure you prove who you are. So if you're going for a benefit on the basis that you're
mm,
Aboriginal, surely you would think there would be some criteria or a burden of proof on the applicant. Now, we see in other countries um, to get benefits of from the government for various tribes in the United States and things like that.
mm,
That there's basically they have blood quantum sort of levels and that in some instances. Not it's not universal, but
mm,
what they did, the government was very smart and allowed the tribes to set their own limits. So
mm,
what you've got in some such systems is like in Florida, because most and on the eastern seaboard, very few Native Americans are left. They were sort of decimated and moved out.
mm,
But when you go to the Midwest and the Plains Indians, well, there's quite still a lot of historic people and big numbers. So their burden of proof is much more intense. You actually have to be at least half indigenous in some tribes. Other tribes, you just have to have some proof of relationship, by marriage a century ago or something like that. So there's a variation, but we've just got to the situation, well, you just say you are, and that's good enough. And it's scary in regards to the benefits that are available by
Mhm.
claiming that.
Yeah, absolutely. But what, this whole thing is a journey for me. I started this, 4 or 5 years ago, right? I haven't come out to the final conclusions, right? And the way I'm going to write my books is everyone needs to just understand what's going out. I'm not sure what the final answer is, but what I'm seeing is Australia is different. This country is unique. It's not like America. It's not like anywhere else, right? It's what I call a mass civilization. So when the British came here, you had half the people in the First Fleet were convicts, and the other half were the administrators, the soldiers, the odd farmer or whatever, and tradesman. Right? We never had an aristocracy, a middle class. There's always been a gap. Right? So in the early years, they had the Rum Rebellion. The New South Wales Court tried to fill that gap and try to manipulate the system, and MacArthur tried to manipulate it. In the 1850s, I think we had someone trying to set up an aristocracy and an aristocratic upper house. And they call it the Bunyip aristocracy, but we laughed and were out of the way. So there's always been this. There's no been a real elites, right? We've all been working class and tradies and things, and politicians, right? But they've never had an upper hand. But then in the 60s and 70s, you had all this black power, all these Marxists, all these intellectuals, and it's not actually coming from Aboriginal people themselves. If you go to a remote community, they know who's Aboriginal. They don't need to go to law courts. They don't need anyone to tell them. But there's this gap in Australia looking for an elites, a bureaucracy, and all these activists got into that. Some of them were part Aboriginal descent, but they don't care if they have fakes. The really Aboriginal activists, they would rather have a fake pro ideologue than a real Aboriginal person who's going to say, well, I don't really agree with that. So they've manipulated the system to allow the fakes to come out. And you look at all these fakes, they employ other fakes, right? So it's not actually in the hands, the determination of Aboriginality in Australia is not in the hands of Aboriginal people per se. It's within the hands of the bureaucracy and these activists. And they've centered on this three-part test, which is the tripartite test. You have to have descent, you've got to identify as Aboriginal, and you've got to be recognised as Aboriginal by your community. We've had 80 definitions of Aboriginality. That's the one we've got now. But that's open to manipulation because I think the powers that be want it to be manipulated, right? They want more Aboriginal voters. That's why the population of Aboriginal people is going from 2 or 300,000. It's past 1 million now, right? Because they want that. Whereas, like you were saying in America, that's controlled. Say the Cherokees, for example, I think they have a 25%. You have to have a grandparent that's a Cherokee. That's because they're a much more integrated, they're running the show themselves. In Australia, it's not Aboriginal people running the show. It's this band of activists that you see on TV all the time. Half of them don't look Aboriginal. They say they are, but they're not. They're the ones running the show, setting the definitions. That's where the problem is.
But there's also a new facet that's occurred too, is that you can have an area and you know what the Aboriginal tribe or mob
Mhm.
historically in that area. But then, like in the instance of Mount Warning,
Yeah,
the people who have been there and recognised as
yeah,
local Indigenous heritage sort of thing, they've been displaced by an
yep,
Aboriginal corporation
yep,
as holding control over that, and that
yep,
corporation is, I think, set up in Sydney. Um,
yep,
and of course, with Queensland, we've got the situation we've just had with Turbia, where the government's handed
yep,
freehold land over to an Indigenous corporation. Now, that Indigenous corporation actually resides on the Sunshine Coast. The people
yep,
it represents, or people who control that, have never ever lived in that area. The
mm,
only thing, there may be a tenuous link that when the railway was being built uh, west to places like Charterville and things like that, there may have been some Indigenous people on the works who may have come from different areas and they've hooked onto that. But it is really now a matter of these Indigenous corporations making all those claims And the other thing is they've got access to lawyers and a lot of services to do their job for them. And unlike the poor old Indigenous people further up north on the Cape,
Mm.
uh, they're not their life's not improving because they don't have the same level of assistance.
Well, you've just described exactly what I'm seeing because you just said it. It's not Aboriginal people on the ground who we all know are Aboriginal. It's these sort of hidden organisations from Sydney, and we got them in Victoria as well. It's not about Aboriginality. It's about class. It's about these people saying, I want to become a rent seeker. I want to sit on my ass. I want to use fancy lawyers and accountants, and I want to collect rent. So in Victoria and Mount Warning and places like that, I know a little bit about the Mount Warning case, and the Aboriginal advisors in that. One of them does have a grandmother or something or grandfather who was Aboriginal, but they've got no Aboriginal culture or anything, but they've been selected because they've been selected by whoever's running the show in Brisbane, the government or whatever, wants to deal with them. They don't want to deal with real Aboriginal people because they're difficult to deal with. There's a whole transfer of wealth and land about to happen in Australia, and so what will happen is the national parks in Victoria, New South Wales, and probably Queensland too, will get transferred to these corporations. They'll get paid by the government to maintain them. They'll go from Crown land, right? And then ultimately they'll go to freehold. It'll take another decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. But ultimately there'll be a new class of Australian in 30, 40, 50 years who's an aristocrat living on a land, a proud such and such a Aboriginal person. It's hereditary. They pass it on to their kids. So we've just introduced what we've never had in Australia, which is an aristocratic class that are rent seekers like they are in England. And it's happened before us and we haven't stood up to it. They tried to do it with a voice. We stopped that, but it's happening in the background right now.
But it's condoned basically by the political class
Absolutely.
and the
Because
academic.
they're getting kickbacks. They're getting kickbacks. That's why.
But they're another group that are in the class warfare thing, the political class and the academics, the elite
Mm.
type thing. Um,
Yeah.
so it fits into their methodology in regards to where they want to
Mm.
go to, and but it still beggars belief that we don't have some sort of burden of proof for all
Mm.
these individual claims, and especially within it's really a problem when it's a blanket First Nations people sort of thing. Maybe
Yeah.
if we go back to people being belonging to they've got to show that they belong to an individual mob and its
Mm.
culture and show the connection to that culture, and
Mm.
that would probably disqualify most of them because they've never lived in an indigenous situation in their life. They're probably born and raised in Sydney in a city,
Mm.
gone to university and got a government job or some NGO job. So they know nothing about the indigenous culture because it was removed several generations ago. So
Mm.
it still is a bit of a worry that that at least the government isn't
Well,
doing something about the burden of proof anyway.
part of the problem is because it's actually not law. There's some legislation where you have to prove the three-part rule. You're of descent, you're recognised, and you're identified. But generally, it's a guideline, right? So the public service do it, right? So I'll just try if I can bring up if I can bring up. Um, can you see that? Is that all right?
No,
Or
you
do I
haven't
have to
clicked.
share that?
Yeah.
Let me just share. Let me just share that. Um, can you see that then?
Not yet.
Hang on, sorry. There,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
So for the viewers, that's Bronwyn Carlson. She's a professor at Macquarie University, right?
Yep.
She wrote the book. I don't know. Can you see that on the little screen? Can you see
Yeah.
that my book,
Yeah. Well,
right?
yes. Just
She
in the small
she
screen up
wrote the
top.
book of she won a grant, the Stanner Grant, for only Aboriginal people, but she won the grant in 2013 for this book, The Politics of Identity. Who counts as Aboriginal today? She wrote the textbook on it, right? But she's a fake, right? So we looked at her, and our genealogist went through all her family trees, right? So that's her winning the award with Professor Tom Palmer. That's her. That's Lady Stanner, which is, the wife of the late anthropologist Stanner. That's Mick Dodson, and I think that's the guy who heads ATSIS, right? She won it for that book. We looked at her family tree, and her family, they all come from Ireland. Ireland, United Kingdom, there's Scotland, there's no Aboriginality at all. So we challenged her, wrote to her, and did all that. That's her family tree all the way to there. And basically, I did a freedom of information on the award. How did she win it? Right. So if I just go back a second, I might do it this way. So I finally got the Freedom of Information Award application form. That's the form she filled in, right?
Yeah.
So this answers your question. How do they do it? So there's the entry form. That's her name. They've redacted some private data. That's okay. But then she says, I have supported my claim to indigeneity through supplying, please tick one of the following. A confirmation of Aboriginal as per the conditions. That's from an Aboriginal tribe.
Yeah.
So she hasn't ticked that. She's got no Aboriginal tribe that's given her a confirmation of Aboriginality. What she's providing the details of two referees for the conditions who vouch for the conditions. They have to vouch for her, and they've got to be culturally appropriate. She's ticked that. So she's got two mates from down the pub who are saying, look, we're culturally appropriate. We think you're Aboriginal. We'll tick the box. And she's got accepted for the award. She's won it, right? And now she's collected all these grants. This was 218,000, the first one she got. Then she got 402,000. Then she got one for 529,000, and then she got one for 570,000. So it's about 1.2 million. So when's the last time the government gave you 1.7 million? When's the last time the government's given you 1.7 million, Bill?
Well,
Haven't you got
they
two
just
mates?
ask for money from me.
Have you got two mates down the pub that would vouch for you?
Uh,
So this is the law, right? Now it gets worse. So what's happened though? So I've been on the Bolt report. I've written to Macquarie University. She won't answer me. She tried to sue me, but she backed off because I wasn't upset by it. She sent me some letters, but basically, before we started questioning her, she was Professor Bronwyn Carlson is an Aboriginal woman, right? 2 days after we went on the Bolt report and said she's a fake, she changed her photo, and now she's just a distinguished professor. She hasn't said she's not Aboriginal, but she's backing away from it. But
fine.
life goes on.
Yeah.
Life goes on.
But the whole thing, I mean, this goes through academia in a lot of cases. But aren't they just fouling their own nest and their own credibility doing this sort of thing? I mean, it's bad enough with our people, our professors. I think Henry Reynolds is one writing Aboriginal history, but and sort of quoting references that don't really exist or don't say anything in regards to what they've written about. I mean, we had the situation with Keith Windshuttle and the and his book, Fabrication of Aboriginal History, and it's plainly obvious. People can saying one thing's like the Indigenous people in Tasmania were great guerrilla warfare and were doing all sorts of damage to the colonial sort of thing, and then in the next breath they're saying there was genocide because they had British had or the colonists had better firepower. And you can't have it both ways, sort of in just those sort of things. But I think what Windshuttle did is he actually went and looked at these references and then went to those sources of in British archives, and they had nothing to do with the topic that was they were supposed to be referencing. So this is a real problem when our academics are not playing the game properly.
It's there's a famous yeah, hang on a minute. Sorry about that. There's a famous guy. His name was Julian Berendt or something. He's a French guy from the 1920s. He wrote a famous paper called The Treason of the Intellectuals. He wrote it in the 1920s. And he was saying that the intellectuals in those days were going far too far to the right, especially in Germany. And they were all getting sucked in by Hitler, all this nationalism and whatever, right? And he warned them. He said, "Look, you're doing all this. You're creating treason because a scholar should say, look, I'm going to do scholarship. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but I'm going to look at this and I'm going to look at that, and I'm going to truthfully say, here's the truth based on the evidence. This is what it is." And what he was seeing, and he turned out to be right. He's saying that people started in academia in Germany because that was the leading part of the world then. All the best universities were in Germany. They were all getting sucked in by Nazism. They all started to select and write pro-Nazi, pro-right-wing scholarship. It influenced them, partly because the Jewish professors were getting kicked out, so they could see that they were going to get more work, right? And they did that, and it ended up in a total disaster. So Hitler didn't do everything on his own. He had this whole intellectual university class behind him, helping him with all the mechanics of it. So there's Neil Ferguson's a historian. He just wrote a paper, an article 6 months ago, saying we're seeing another treason of the intellectuals, right? But this time it's not on the right; it's on the left. So for the last 20 or 30 years, all the scholars have been in there and manipulating the system to go left, to go woke, right? Professor Blaney was kicked out of Melbourne Uni, right? In universities now, it's something like, 20 or 30 to 1, left wing versus right wing. It's not 50-50. There's no diversity of ideas anymore because intellectuals and academics do that. So they cheat. And that's what they're doing. So with this Professor Bronwyn Carlson, 50 years ago, she would have been sacked. But she doesn't get sacked now because the university needs the money. The government is saying, you employ Indigenous professors, you employ Indigenous students, we'll give you more money. And the vice chancellor is earning $1 to $1.5 million a year. He needs that university to make money. So the last thing he wants to do, she's brought in, she's just an average academic, but she's pulled in $1.7 million for her little part of the department. Plus, she gets other money because she's Indigenous. He doesn't want to sack her. He's manipulating his scholarship to keep this woman in because she's fits the bill. She's part of the woke system. She's what he wants. It's not truthful, but we don't worry about truth anymore. And how you line your pockets. This is the world we're in.
Well, we've got a situation now where Bill Shorten has just left politics and he's taken up a position as Australian National University, and I think he as Vice Chancellor, and he's got to be on somewhere about $1.25 million a year. So, and that is really the role of the Chancellor and Vice Chancellor in those positions, is to make sure the university is funded, and and part of that is also ensuring that your professors and your staff body are out there with the narrative that generates gifts, donations from benefactors, philanthropists, and also grants from government. So that's their core function. And and the trouble is, the truth is getting bent from that activity.
But this is the thing. That in my mind, that's the biggest problem. It's unethical and it's immoral, right? So put the scholarship to the side for the moment. They're not doing their scholarship. That's one thing, but it's basically immoral and unethical, right? And Bill Shorten would have been one of the first people to say companies have to have a social license. Remember social license?
Yeah.
New companies, you can't do this and everything. Whereas they're running universities where they don't have, in my opinion, I'm not giving them a social license to operate as a university as long as they do this, right? So we shouldn't be giving them a social license because they're lying, they're manipulating, they're not educating their kids properly. They're encouraging kids to think that apartheid, right, separateness is normal, right? You and I are old enough to remember the old apartheid. We don't want that anymore, right? And this is the thing, that they've got no standards anymore, right, for their class of people.
But
This
the
is
other thing
mental.
is, too, you touched on it before, and I'll put up a couple of screenshots about
Mm.
how indigeneity has become popular. Um,
Hmm.
if we go back to the 50s and 60s, it wasn't a. It's just like looking up your history and whether you're a convict. Most people didn't even
Yeah.
bother about it, but it has
Yeah.
become fashionable. Uh,
Hmm.
Claiming you're a convict, it doesn't give you any benefit really, but just it's
Mm.
self-satisfaction. You know where you came from, sort of thing. But
Yeah.
claiming to be Aboriginal can give you a financial
Mm.
benefit and advantage. So it's become a little bit more popular. And I'll just put up the graphs of Australia's population. There you can see Australia's population from 1966 to 2021. These are by the
Mm.
census. And we've gone from 11 million to 25 million over 60 odd years. Now,
Mhm.
so we're just heading towards half. We've doubled our
Yeah.
population sort of thing
Yeah.
over that time. And as you go through, even with migration, we've never really exceeded 10% growth in
Yeah.
our in between census. So that's a pretty normal trend, even with our mass
Mm.
population in the last 4 or 5 years. But if we look at the claims of being Indigenous, in
Mm.
'66 there was only 80,000. And
Hmm.
I know the referendum didn't come into 67 to count people on the census, but
Yeah.
the states knew everyone who was Indigenous. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a state responsibility for Indigenous people, whether you like it or not, the protectorship and that. But
Mm.
they knew everyone that they were responsible for, and the reason they weren't in the census in the first place was because the states were responsible and they didn't have to be put into the money basket as for what the
Yeah.
census does for the overall population because there was a separate group looking after them from the states. So, but the 67 referendum, and a lot of people look at it was some watershed, but it didn't do anything. All it did is right say Indigenous are going to be counted in the census, and B, the
Yeah.
Commonwealth is allowed to make laws, and basically to
Yeah.
override some of the state laws that are still a bit discriminatory. But it was not really a big watershed moment. But we've gone from under 100
Mm.
under 80,000 before the referendum. After the referendum, we just got up 115,000.
Mm.
But in the preceding years we've gone up to 812,000 in the last census. That's an eightfold increase, and yet Australian
Yeah.
population has only doubled. And some of these increases have been as much as 25% over one census
Yeah.
period. So it's quite
It's
amazing that this has happened, and the government hasn't even given it a bit of thought because the budget for Indigenous is quite hefty. So
yeah.
it does impact on us. So I think
Mm.
that's something that should people should just be aware of in regards to and and I know people who claim to Aboriginality on the basis for fishing license and things like that, but they have no malice. It's just to be But
Yeah.
a lot of these people are actually making a livelihood of it, and also
Hmm.
just gaming the whole Australian population.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So on that graph, I could see at the bottom, it's growing good 20%, right? The indigenous population, it was about 10% growth, but now it's 20. And I think it's the last one, it's over a million now. It's cracked a million, right? And it's going to keep increasing. So let's just have a thought bubble here, right? Because there's some of the people we talk about all this sort of stuff. We say, look, all right, the closing of the gap, this thing, the closing of the gap, it's not working, right? The quickest way to close the gap is if we all tick the box on the next census, right? And
Yep.
we all say we're Indigenous, because then all of a sudden, if the politicians can't close the gap after 20 years' work, let's close it by just ticking the box because then all the numbers will coalesce and we'll all be earning about the same and it'll be gone, right? And it's technically not illegal in a sense because the ABS only goes on a two-part system. You have to identify as Indigenous and you've got to have descent. Now, whether you've got descent or not, people you just think, well, I think I've got descent. My grandma told me,
Yeah.
right? You don't need community recognition on the ABS system, so it's not right. But some people are getting so sick of it all, they'll think, I'm just going to tick the box and that'll close the gap. Then we won't hear this rubbish anymore. We'll all get on with our lives. So that's what's coming, and it's only going to keep growing because there's that old saying. I think it's a John Singleton saying, "It's only a rort if you're not in on it." Right? Right. So we're all saying, "Oh, it's a rort," but if we all tick the box and get in on it, it's not a rort anymore.
But the worst
Um,
thing about it, I'm in North Queensland in Cairns at the moment, and
hmm,
North Queensland's got the biggest Indigenous population by percentage by far
hmm,
across the nation,
yeah.
uh, with mixed culture. Northern Territory, of course, is even more intense.
Hmm,
But the thing is, all this is not improving Indigenous life one iota.
yeah.
It's not deriving them any benefit. They are seeing people benefit from it, in the
Hmm.
capital cities and things like that, and these elites, and it must grate them in
Well,
regards to what's happening. But they have no voice. I mean, if you're out on Arnhem Land or up on Cape York, no one's taken any notice, and no one's come around with a TV crew and say, "How do you feel about so and so claiming to be
hmm.
Indigenous and that you're all farmers and things like that?" It just doesn't happen, and I'm sure a lot of academics don't want it to happen either.
No, but see, you're Bill. Your problem is, Bill. You're a genuine person of goodwill, right? You want to help the people, but you fundamentally missed what's going on here. The elites in the cities who are getting the money, they do not want to close the gap. They have to have the victims. They have to be able to sit in camera and say, "Look, there's this community out there. Give me more money to give to them." The moment that community in the regional or the remote area is improved and the gap's closed, these people lose their power base. They lose their existence. So they don't want the people that you're talking about to improve because it's a con. It's rent seeking. They're setting up their own aristocracy and they want to feed on the misfortune of these Aboriginal people. Whereas the average public, we've got nothing but goodwill for Aboriginal people. We don't want them to struggle and whatever. We want them to get educated. We're spending 30 odd billion, I think, on Aboriginal affairs. Where's the money going? It's being chewed up by non-Aboriginal people and the elites.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I am quite aware of what's going on. I mean, we've got a
Hmm,
situation where NGOs who are supposed to provide service for Indigenous, especially juveniles, and badly behaved ones, in Cairns, we've got about 13 NGOs that provide
hmm,
accommodation, beds for Indigenous kids. Um, and they get somewhere between 180 and $200,000 per bed they supply.
hmm,
Now, they obviously need to keep going, otherwise their paychecks go to disappear.
yeah,
And those NGOs, they've got no control. They might provide a bed, so these kids will come to these safe places, stay there during the
hmm,
daytime, but at night time they're out doing whatever they do. And the people who run it, they're not usually there's no one supervisor after 5 o'clock, and even if they know the kids have committed a crime, they're not allowed to not allowed to report them. So they're not doing anyone any favors, but they're collecting a whole bunch of money. Now we've
hmm,
just heard from Mr. Albanese. He's just gone. Well, I don't know if he even went to Alice Springs, but he's just pumped 800 and something million dollars over to fix up their problems. Yeah, that money's just going to be eaten up by NGOs. It's not putting any
hmm,
more people on the ground. It's not putting police on the ground. It's not putting services on the ground that's got to improve things. It's just got to another trough for these NGOs to feed on.
hmm. That's the thing. So you got to say, well, why is that, right? So the thing is, it's not rocket science. All you have to do to improve your life is to, get an education, find someone, fall in love, get married, have kids, get a good steady job so that you can afford a house. And that's all you really have to do. And it's not, you don't necessarily need all this highfalutin stuff. That's how you have to help people. So you've got to give them jobs. You've got to say to some people in remote areas, look, you can't have a first class life if you're going to live in a really remote area. If you want to really get on, you've got to come into a town or a city. If you want to live right out there, well, you're always going to struggle, right? I think most of the problems what I see it's people that live on the periphery, like the young kids. They're not getting the discipline, they're not getting the education, not getting the schooling, and that's what you've got to do. You've got to somehow tell those kids, look, we'll look after you, we'll give you a really good education, but you've got to go to a boarding school. Or we've got to build more schools in regional areas that they can go to. I don't know, something like that.
Well, I think the emphasis has been far too much on keeping the kids in households where
Mm.
they're not really loved and cherished and
Yeah.
and neglected, and maybe they fit. These kids say that one of their common traits is that would rather be out on the streets than at home because it's safer.
Yeah.
So we're ignoring a problem that's in the household. We're not
Mm-hmm.
going in and approaching that. We're not sort of getting these parents and so, well, you're neglecting your kids, so you're going to get charged with something, and we've got to put
Mm.
your kids into what we used to have years ago, orphanages or something like that. We've
Mm-hmm.
gone away from that community care institutions, and yeah, some of them had a bit of notorious history, but I still remember places like Castlederg and Clontarf in West Australia.
Mm.
They had a percentage of Indigenous kids from remote areas, and they integrated well. They were just in the general thing. I mean, I
Mm.
sat there because I wasn't behaving myself overly well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so so this
Yeah, but
fear
that's
of
part of
institutions, this fear of
yeah, I was just going to say, but
rebuilding the institution is a bit of a problem.
I was just going to say that's part of the politics because that's from the stolen generations ideology, right? So they made a lot of political mileage out of having the stolen generations. So part of that was you couldn't take kids out of their cultural environment. So for ideological reasons, so that they're not looking after the welfare of the kid, right? So they're saying you can't take them out of a dysfunctional family because you're creating another stolen generation. And that's the reprehensible part of all this. These people in the cities, so some of the academics I'm following, they're writing all these highfalutin uh, intellectual papers, PhD papers on the problem, but they live in a city. They're all on good money. They're not dysfunctional, but they're sucking that money in. They're writing papers that are meant to be helping fix the problem, but they don't. It's just the whole thing is a machine. So if I was in charge, I would just turn the tap off. I wouldn't give grants to Professor Bronwyn Carlson of $400,000 or $500,000. I just say, look, that's not going to help these kids. I'm gonna take the 30 million that we're putting into grants at Macquarie University, and I'm going to build two regional schools, one in Alice Springs and one in Mackay or somewhere, Townsville, right? Or Cairns, and just say this is what's going to happen. We've got to go out there and educate these kids. That's the problem. The money, it's the rivers of gold. The rivers of money are going to the universities and the NGOs, the educated middle classes, and that's partly because we've got too many people that went to uni. They didn't go to uni to study medicine like I did science, which are practical. I worked in factories all my life, or dentistry, or engineering. They've gone into soft options, and those people have to come out and have soft option careers, and that's what's chewing up the money.
I think it's also interesting if you go through any university's staff list, they're all got uh,
Yeah,
big departments. And one, of course,
yeah,
climate
mm,
change. The other one is
yeah,
Indigenous studies. They're
that's right.
huge. I mean, they've got not only the heads of the department, but there's a lot of professors, and then under them there's a lot of researchers and stuff like that. And the amount of papers on Aboriginal history or events or whatever, or
Mm.
people, it's huge. There's volumes. I reckon there's more academic papers, or tenfold, 15-fold, maybe 100-fold
Mm.
academic papers on Indigenous culture and history and that compared to the settlers that actually built the country. Like that's what we
Absolutely.
don't look at our history, value of history. I mean, we went from in 113 years, we went from a colonial settlement to a sovereign nation. I mean,
Mm.
that's huge. There should be tons of scholarships on that sort of thing.
Mm.
Yet there's nothing really go in regards to settler history and things like that, and Australian
Mm.
history.
Well, see, that's one of the reasons why I keep doing this sort of work, because my theory is the fakes are the chink in the armor of this whole conglomerate that you've just been talking about, right? So if I can say that there's all these fakes there, right, that will delegitimize this whole project they've got going, because I'll be able to say, look, we can't believe that paper you've written. You don't even know whether they're Aboriginal. You're faking it, right? So you've got to delegitimize it. No one is standing up and calling this stuff out, because all the conservative centre right historians, they've all been sacked, they've all gone, or they're too scared, they're going to be cancelled. So the trick, one of the best ways in Australia is to beat your opposition is to humiliate them, show that they're being hypocritical, right? And just people will end up saying, "Nah, that's rubbish, mate." And it's the same as the old saying for the voice referendum. What was it? Yeah, nah, right? So we all listened to what the voice was about. We said, yeah, but nah, I'm not going to vote for that. And in the end, that won. Advance Australia did a really good, just a basic Aussie campaign, pointing out how stupid it was. And that's what I've got to do. I've got to keep going with this and point out how these fakes, they're real fakes and they're everywhere. And then you can suddenly say, look, I don't have to listen to you. I mean, I used to listen to academics and judges and high court judges, but now I think, Dark Emu Exposed said that you're bullshitting about this, you're bullshitting about that. And that will delegitimize their whole project, right? But someone has to turn off the money tap. So whether the politicians in Canberra have got the courage to turn off the money tap, I don't know. That's the problem.
Well, it may happen, but I'm not overly hopeful if the
Mm.
coalition does win government and maybe Jacinta Price has a bit of a
Mm.
influence on the situation. But I certainly wasn't encouraged last Thursday, which was Sorry Day, when
Yeah.
Albanese got up there in Parliament and reiterated all our bad deeds in regards to
Mm.
stolen generation. Uh, but it just beggared belief how easily Dutton followed in behind, and just
Mm.
rattled off the same garbage. Yet, as Bolt shows, there's never been a case proven in the courts. It's never happened. There was no systemic effort to take kids out from happy homes or anything like that. Most of those people, I mean, if I was a descendant of some of those Aboriginal protectors, I think Neville was the
Mm.
guy in West Australia.
Yeah.
He was his history. You can go and look at his diaries and all the interaction with the government, because one
Mm.
of the greatest things about the British and colonial history is they had to write journals. They had to send stuff back
Oh.
to the colonial office. They had to keep diaries. And it's interesting because all those sort of things also have verification, because it usually wasn't just one person keeping a diary or information of what's going on.
Mm.
There were several people, there might have been attracted, but there would also be a surgeon or something as part of the
Mm.
system, or a pastor in the area who also was contracted to provide records and things like that. So it's not just a one-off person saying,
Mm.
and what would a person writing something 150 years ago say? Well, I better lie about this because in 150 years,
That's right.
it won't look good or something like that.
Yeah.
They never thought of that but that's how the academics portray it,
Mm.
that these people were doing, bad things. But
Mm.
yeah, so
But see
it's
but I was going to say that's why it's reprehensible. It's not just we're not just arguing about virtual, history stuff here. These are real kids. They're real kids in remote and regional Australia, Aboriginal children who are being badly treated, but everyone's standing up in Parliament saying, oh, we're sorry about the stolen generations. Therefore, we're not going to look after these kids and take them out of dysfunctional families. if we were just arguing about history or something, it's one thing, but it's actually real. These children are not getting their human rights attended to because the politicians are all too scared to call a spade a spade. And that's where it is really bad. It's reprehensible. It's not just argumentative. It's really, really bad.
I think also what's happened too, it's even in our society, and that they're bit loath to take kids out of family situations, basically because they got nowhere to put them. I mean, back in the olden times sort of thing, they went to state care, and there was a number of organisations that were set up to look after them, besides foster
Mm.
parenting and stuff like that. Today, there's nothing like that there, so there's always this problem of finding places for them. We've got to invest in those things so we can do it. And the other thing is we also got to stop saying, the stolen generation, because I don't care what
Yeah.
anyone says. A lot of these people were saved from the
But
circumstances, and the whole life and the descendants' life have improved,
yeah.
heaps.
Well,
Because
you know
if
where
you
the
look,
word I was just going to say, where the word stolen comes from? You know why they're called stolen? Because the guy, Peter Reid was the guy, he was a ANU PhD student. He'd done some research in New South Wales and he'd met a lot of Aboriginal people that seemed to be lost in their lives. They didn't have careers, didn't do anything. And wrote this pamphlet and he was trying to put it down towards colonialism or whatever. And he called it the Lost Generations, which is, an okay name, right? His wife came into the room and said, "Hang on, Pete, that's not very gripping. Call it the
that's sweet.
Stolen Generations." Because then that creates an obligation on the rest of us. We've kidnapped these kids. It's our fault. If they had been just lost, that's sort of a community responsibility. But now that they're stolen, all of a sudden that sets up this mentality that it's your fault. You white colonialists stole the kids. And so everything is ideologically loaded, right? And that's the problem.
Well, the classic case would have to be Jodie Bourne, who's I think she's the CEO of the uh, Indigenous agency in Canberra that's got a
Hmm.
multi-billion-dollar budget, and sort of also runs a lot of the programs and
Mm.
that where the $30 billion is spent. Now,
Mm.
her claim to fame is that her mother was one of the stolen generations out of the Kimberley's area or Pilbara area in West Australia. Now, supposedly her mother was taken there and put into mission and put into domestic duties. And this is one of the things that I find surprising. People carry on that these girls were put into a situation they would do domestic duties like clean floors, or do washing, do
Mm.
ironing, and stuff like that. Well, guess what? Back in the 40s and 50s and those sort of things,
Mm.
most people did all those chores anyway. It was part of
That's
just
right.
life.
Yeah.
They didn't have washing machines and all those sort of things, automatic white goods that we had today.
Mm.
It was part of the life it was. And her mother obviously married another white person, so she was already mixed blood. She married a white
Mm.
person, and if you look at Jodie Bourne, you would not recognise, wouldn't say that she's Aboriginal. Well, it's done her well in regards to her mother was taken from the Kimberleys, put into
Mm.
a mission, and then went on to live in Perth and marry well and have a daughter, because Jodie Bourne's on about $600,000 a year in Canberra.
Mm.
So
That's right.
that's not a bad exchange for coming her mother coming out of the Pilbara under those circumstances. What's the life of someone who stayed there? That should
Mm.
be a comparison. I mean, they're probably still on a subsistence living. So the definition of stolen is somewhat a little bit rich, I think.
Yeah, but they couldn't have been stolen because kidnapping is illegal. And if it's illegal, if you were stolen, well, you just go to the police, right? And you say, I was stolen. But that's never happened because they weren't stolen. But the problem with our society, the way it's gone, there's no such thing as gratefulness or gratitude anymore, right? So bad things happen to all of us, right? But touch wood, I've had a pretty good life. I've had bad things, but mostly I'm grateful for being born in Australia and having a good life. I've got gratitude. Whereas all the people you're talking about, they can't bring themselves to mention the word grateful or gratitude. It's all about, oh, we were stolen, we were oppressed, you're racist, because that's where the money is. That's what they do. So it's unethical and it's immoral. So that's the problem. Our society has really changed. Everyone used to have more fortitude when they were younger. Now we all want to be victims because there's money in it. It's a fundamental problem for Australia, and it's not good. We're hollowing out our self-confidence. That's why we're going broke, right? Our debt's going up. We can't even dig holes anymore to make money. We industry is shutting. We have a big, serious problem in Australia because we're all becoming bludgers. It's bludgeonomics, I call it, bludgers, victims, right? And no one's got get up and go. And if they do, they often leave the country. They go to America, go to Europe, go somewhere else, go to Asia. So it's a
Okay,
big problem.
we've gone over the hour. Can you give us a bit of an idea what your plan is going forward with your group?
Yes.
How many are in your group working together?
Mm.
And are the production of the next three books the top of the priorities, or are there
Yeah.
other things in
So
train?
So what I'm doing, I'm about 80% finished the book on Andrew Bolt, right? Because that's a good example. He was stitched up. I've got all the information to show he's stitched up, and then I've got a general book on the fakes. So we're doing books on these fake people, and I'm not scared anymore because what it is. The good thing about Andrew Bolt's case was the judge, Morty Bromberg, everyone sort of said, oh, he's a radical, but he actually gave a judgment and he said, he wrote in his judgment, it is not illegal to challenge someone as to their Aboriginality, right? But Andrew Bolt did that, but he said Andrew Bolt did it in the wrong manner. His tone was wrong. He was too sarcastic. That's why Andrew lost, right? And everyone's collapsed and then no one's done anything. But I've read the judgment. So what I do, I challenge people now. I write a letter to them. And just to go through it, I never challenge anyone who's a nobody, a private person. What you do in your private life, in your own family, your own community, I don't care. But the moment you stand up in the public square and you say, I'm getting money from the government because I'm Aboriginal, or I won this award because I'm Aboriginal, Justice Bromberg, the judge, has given me the ability now to write a nice civil letter to this person and say, um, can you please tell me who your Aboriginal ancestor is and whatever? And they always, invariably, they don't answer me. Then I do we've got about, say, 20 people, but we've got a core of 5 or 6 researchers and genealogists. I do the family tree, and each one costs thousands. The most expensive I've spent is 10 grand on one person, which is going to break next week or the week after. It's going to, hopefully, the Australian says they're going to run with it. I don't know if they've got courage yet, but if they don't, Andrew Bolt will. But usually we spend 2,000, 5,000, 6,000. So the most I've done is 10,000 because this guy, he's got his mother's side has 800 A4 pages of research. He goes back to the First Fleet. He's got his ancestor came on the First Fleet not as a convict but as a free man. There's only a handful of them, and he doesn't want to acknowledge that. He would rather put a T-shirt on and pretend to be Aboriginal. Aboriginal people are never going to accept him because he's not Aboriginal, but he would rather fake a life than say, look at my family, we came on the First Fleet. This is how much people hate their own country now. Anyway, so he'll break. So I'm going to keep breaking people, write these books. And the idea is to get to the position where it gets out into the general media and people say, nah, I've had enough of this crap. We don't like this. And all the people, the biggest fakes, they're all on the left. They're very woke. There's a couple of politicians. The South Australian Attorney General is the first Australian Aboriginal Attorney General in South Australia. I think the first Aboriginal Attorney General in the whole of Australia, and he's a fake, total fake. And I don't want to live in a country where the highest lawmaker in one of our states is faked. He's saying I'm Aboriginal, he's not. So either he signed a stat dec or whatever. Andrew Bolt's challenged him. This guy, Kyan Ma, the Honourable Kyan Ma, the Attorney General of South Australia, has been on the ABC saying, no, I'm not going to even discuss it. The ABC's chasing him. This is the country we've come to. right? So that's the Attorney General. So all I have to do is keep going, and suddenly the dam will break. There are so many coming out that someone will do something about it. What that is, I don't know, but we'll see.
Well,
That's
the other thing we're hoping too is that ordinary people get more emboldened to question and demand
yeah,
some response from their politicians. I think
yeah,
that's a very important part,
yeah,
because it's all public money, and we most people know our infrastructure is falling apart. We're not getting any
yep,
sort of real wealth creating projects. All the money seems to be going on welfare
mm,
and social
yep.
cohesion and everything else you can think of. So hopefully the ordinary person gets involved and starts, go and telling their, asking questions to their local members. Well, what's going on about this? Why is all this money going here? And why isn't it being directed to wealth creation, better services, hospitals, aged care, schools, and things like that? So I hope that's part of it as
Well,
going forward, that we
well,
get more confidence.
that's right. And when I write to people, I say, look, I think you're mistaken about it. Here's your family tree. And I always have a disclaimer. I say, look, there might be a unknown Aboriginal adoption in your family, or someone might have had a relationship with an Aboriginal person that's not recorded. I give them the information, but invariably, I think we know more about their family than they do. And invariably, it's people like, oh, my grandma told me we were Aboriginal, or we were tarred with the brush. That's what Bronwyn Carlson said. Her family rumor in the family was, oh, there was a touch of the tar brush in the family. So she said, oh, we must be Aboriginal. It's not good enough. And you're a scholar. You're meant to be the scholar. You should be able to do your own family tree to prove it. So I'm doing that. And then once I do it and it gets in the general media, then like you say, average people will say, hang on, I saw this on the Bolt Report, or I read it in the Sydney Morning Herald. This guy's doing the work. I'm going to write to my local member who says he's Aboriginal, and I'm going to ask him, where's your proof? That's all you got to do. There's nothing illegal about it.
I think one of the other interesting things too, in regards to the judge in the Bolt case, is giving you a way forward, but at the
Mhm.
same time, he didn't really run with the letter of the law. He seemed to be working on an idea or a vibe or something, and this seems
Yeah.
to be a lot of the problem today. Um, we've got progressive judges who think they should introduce
Mm.
progressivism into the law system. And I don't
Yeah.
think that's what the law is there, because I don't know if you know him, Professor James Allen, as an
Mm.
academic and not a practicing lawyer, but he has,
Mm.
some scathing stories and articles into the um, Quadrant and Spectator in regards to some of the High Court decisions and that. And
Mm.
basically, is saying that these people aren't really running with the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. It's vibe, feeling, and other bits and pieces. So, are activist judges um, a complete hindrance, or can we also use them as well if we
Um,
know the game?
Yeah, in my book that I'm just doing now on Andrew Bott, I quote like Justice Kirby. He's pretty open about it. I'm not sort of what sort of judge he was, but he's addressed this issue, and he said, look, there are always going to be activist judges, and sometimes I'm not sure that in history, occasionally an activist judge might have done the right thing, right? But there's always that tension between the legislators who say this is the law and this is what we intend to be by the law, and then the judge manipulates that. Now, sometimes they manipulate it for what turns to be a social good, but other times, and I think that's what's happened in Andrew Polsco, they're manipulating for their own kudos, their own sense of, well, a bit of power. There's a lot of power in judges. They're frustrated legislators, right? They think, they've got a very high opinion in themselves and they want to change things. So what would have happened in the Bolt case if they had have gone to appeal? The judgment might have got overturned. So that particular judge, Morty Bromberg, has loses quite a few appeals. He's the one that did some climate change ones that got over appealed. I think he did the one where they said contract labourers were the same as full-time employees. That got overturned because they're activists. They pushed the boundary, but they're all down the pub in Brunswick afterwards, all with all their lefty mates saying, "I've done a great job." This is the thing. It's a clique. They're trying to change our society through either the universities, through fake Aborigines, or through the judges. And this has always had this tension, and the world has gone woke. So you're going to get more of these woke things. But I don't think anyone's got a solution. It's up to, well, it's actually the politicians. They got to write the legislation that the judges can't get around, or if they get around it, they've got to rewrite the legislation, like the court case where the Aboriginal aliens, now they're non-aliens, those two New
Yeah,
Zealand guys,
the love
right?
love case, I think.
Love, right? So here's
I
these
think James Allen was pretty scathing about that determination.
absolutely. So this guy, like Love and Tom's, I think they're both in a category of their own. They're citizens, they're non-citizens, but they're non-aliens. There's only two of them in the country. They're in their own little class, and it's ridiculous, right? So the politicians have to go and change the law and turn it over. But I think you're always going to have that. But sometimes we can use that to our advantage and say, look, the law's an ass. This is what it did. This is what it means. And who knows? But it's a problem.
Okay, then look, we'll wind it up there. But if you'd just like to make a
Yeah.
little announcement in regards to your organisation and that, we'll also post it up on there when this gets
Sure.
sent out to the Facebook. We'll have the links to your
Hmm.
sites as well.
Perfect. Look, thanks very much, Bill. Thanks for putting me on the show. And I keep telling everyone, I'm a nobody. I was just started with one keyboard and a hatred of a book, right? And now I've been on TV. I write on this thing. I've got all these other people, and it's actually a relief because all these other people say, "Thank God, someone is basically saying on the Bolt Report or in their books what I've been thinking. I thought I was the only one." And so when you have your program, it sort of goes to all these people. So at least we know we're not the only people, and we can head in a certain direction. And then hopefully it gets bigger and bigger, and it does work. Like Advance have done really well in this sort of space, right? And that's why the Voice got defeated. The left and Albanese didn't think they were going to lose. They thought they had it in the bag. But the landscape is changing through people like you, just little people that can do things.
Okay, then. Look,
Yeah.
I'd like to thank you coming on tonight at short
Right.
notice, and especially we had the floods up here, and we were going to have a couple of people from Mackay, publishers of local newspapers,
Yeah.
but flood events caused that to um,
Mm.
uh, them to be otherwise engaged. So I really thank you and appreciate you for coming on at short notice
Right.
and answering the call. I really appreciate it. If you could just stay
Good.
on the line, I'll introduce
Sure.
next week's episode and just have a quick talk off air. Thanks very
Sure.
much. I
Okay.
really appreciate it. If you
That's all
enjoyed
right.
today's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, we will be having Rebecca Dothwaite on. She's the publisher of Mackay and Whit Sunday Live. So please join us again, and we'll get an insight of what the local papers are doing and how well they're doing and the risks that they face from the major newspapers with the funding that's going on. So please join us again next week. Thank you.